Good afternoon, fellow students. I will be summarizing the third chapter in the Gehart text. Chapter 3 is about the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic counseling and psychotherapy. Chapter 3 in the Gehart text is over psychoanalysis, except here we see the ever-expanding approach of psychoanalysis as two separate entities, the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic counseling and psychotherapies. All of the aforementioned techniques are considered depth psychologies because they explore the unconscious mind, which is conceptualized as deeper than the conscious mind. Freudian psychoanalysis is a root of all psychodynamic approaches, with ego psychology, object relations psychology, self-psychology, and a whole slew of other psychological approaches within the psychoanalysis field. Psychoanalysis always refers to Freud's original approach, and it describes long-term counseling with multiple weekly sessions where a therapist uses the blank slate technique. The psychodynamic counseling refers to a more standard, short-term, one session per week outpatient counseling style, but still, it is rather a lengthy process. With both approaches to the psychoanalytic theory, there are basic assumptions that the therapist will follow. A person's history affects a person's present behaviors that a person demonstrates, and will have a subconscious that exerts a significant influence over our present behaviors. A personality is structured into various substructures, such as the ego, id, and superego. A person's personality is significantly impacted by the early relationships in life, especially with one's parents or the primary caretaker. Insight into a person's internal dynamics will help resolve various pathologies that a client will use projection and transference to demonstrate patterns of behavior. Thus, it will be up to the therapist to be able to read the subtle cues and exert or implement a plan of change. At the most basic level, the psychodynamic theory is about analyzing a person's personality, the characteristic and habits of that individual. In doing so, the therapist should have an idea on how to better understand how the internal dynamics affect the presenting problem and the general quality of life a person has. The basic practice of the psychoanalytic is analyzing or conceptualizing personality structures and functioning and bringing it to the attention of the person by using a modified form of empathy. Empathy is to be the understanding of the client's problem and addressing aloud to the client that the therapist understands by reiterating the client's problems or issues at hand. Next, the therapist then finally working through the insight towards action. There are many schools of psychoanalytic and all use a different quality of the counseling relationship, with some being more empathetic versus other approaches within the psychoanalysis field. Within psychoanalysis lies many schools of counseling theory, such as drive theory, ego psychology, objects relation, self-psychology, interpersonal and relational intersubjectivity psychology. All approaches revolve around the premise of bringing the unconscious into unconscious so the client can better make choices and behaviors can be made appropriately. Within the approaches of psychoanalysis, we have the psychoanalysis in general, which is based on Freud's original theories. Classic psychoanalysis is a relatively rare but still practiced approach that focuses on analysis of innate drives and transference issues. Next, we have the ego psychology. Similar to Freudian theory in terms of working relationship, the ego psychology focuses on analysis of how the ego uses defense mechanisms to manage innate drives. Object relations theories, using a more empathetic and warmer counseling relationship, object relations theories focus on repairing the client's early object counseling relationship. There are several schools of object relations theory, each using a unique system of analysis. Next, we have the interpersonal analysis. Related to object relations, interpersonal analysis is unique in that the analysis process relies heavily on the observable data and focuses almost exclusively on the interpersonal interactions rather than unconscious processes. Self-psychology is based on the work of Gehart. Self-psychology involves empathetic immersion in the client's inner world, analysis of self-objects, and a focus on building self-esteem. Rational and intersubjectivity theories are recent approaches that emphasize the intersubjective nature of reality and employ a more collaborative counseling relationship with the client. And lastly, we have a brief psychodynamic theory. It's time-limited, evidence-based approaches that have been demonstrated effective with depression and substance abuse. Throughout all the approaches of the psychoanalysis, we all have some basic assumptions. The vast majority of the psychodynamic theorists share the following basic assumptions. A person's history affects present behaviors and relationships. There is an unconscious mind that exerts significant influence over present behavior. The personality is structured into various substructures such as id, ego, and superego. A person's personality is significantly impacted by the early relationships built upon the early childhood friends, the parents, the primary caretakers, and the early school years. And clients will ultimately project onto the counselor their irrational patterns from earlier unresolved issues. Most often with the client's parents, the transference of these patterns can be analyzed and used to promote change in the counseling relationship. Transference is something that is quite greatly seen in the psychoanalytic approach, as well as countertransference. With transference, we refer to when a client projects onto the counselor's attributes that stem from unresolved issues with the primary caregivers. Therapists use the immediacy of these interactions to promote insight and work through the conflicts. Transference is supposed to reveal the unconscious templates that the client brings to the relationship of the client and therapist over and over again. And it is up to the therapist to read up on these cues and promote change through the transference that the client puts onto the therapist. Countertransference. As counselors, we need to be aware and extremely mindful of the countertransference, as this can hinder the therapeutic relationship. Once the transference and countertransference patterns have been carefully considered and assessed, the therapist or analyst can use this information to provide clients with a corrective emotional experience. When we think of psychoanalysis, most people automatically think of Sigmund Freud, but there are many scholars whom have contributed to the study of psychoanalysis. For an example, Anna Freud and Karen Horney, as well as Erikson, assisted with further developing the ego psychology. Otto Kernberg, Minnie Klein, and many other scholars have developed object relation psychology and go into depth about their experiments. Ultimately, psychoanalytic and the psychodynamic counseling has been stitched together by many theories within many individuals collaborating and coming together over the past 100 years. The overview of the counseling process within the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approaches. In general, current psychodynamic counseling approaches involves 3 generic phases: listening with empathy to reduce the defensiveness and increase willingness to hear interpretations. This means listening objectively without offering advice, reassurance, validation, or confronting the client as they speak, and they speak through free association. Number 2, the interpretations to promote insight. The focus is to encourage insight into the personal and interpersonal dynamics, usually done by applying concepts or a conceptualization of the client's problems at hand. And number 3, the last generic phase within the counseling process is working through insight to promote new action or to promote change. At this point, the unconscious should be made conscious, and the client can move forward with whichever problem or issues they had, and it should be able to have been resolved by then. Within most of the approaches in the psychoanalytic, we will see defense mechanisms that pop up subconsciously. The psychoanalysis delves into the unconscious, and it is very likely to see clients express defense mechanisms brought on by the unconscious, such as denial, introjections, which wholly means accepting the behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes that others impose onto us without really having a say of our own. Splitting is the inability to see thyself as an integrated whole that has both positive and negative aspects or attributes about themselves. Another defense mechanism is projection, falsely attributing one's own false assumptions onto others, and usually this is done forcefully, without notice. And lastly, we have regression, subconsciously hindering some innate impulses at times. Impulses can be both good or bad, as well as detrimental to health. Now, within these approaches of the psychoanalysis, we are targeting change and goal setting. And the general goals of psychoanalysis are having specific theories of health. Psychodynamic approaches share similar long-term goals. These are general goals that define mental health. They include the following: decreased irrational impulses, early and middle phases, increased ability to manage stress, decreased use of the defensive mechanisms, increased ego strength, which is self-esteem and self-cohesion, increased insight followed by agency, increased emotional maturity and intelligence, decreased perfectionism, decreased internal conflict and personality integration, and lastly, the increased ability to experience mature dependency and intimacy. And in doing so, the client and the therapist will work together and build up some sort of intervention. The interpretation and working through the resistance is something that the client and therapist will do together. The most basic technique that all psychoanalytic approaches use are interpretations of the unconsciousness material to facilitate client insight. Numerous possibilities exist for the interpretation, such as dreams, fantasies, and daydreams, symptoms, transference and countertransference, which are extremely important within the relationship of both the therapist and the client, and favorite metaphors and words of choices. And we also can consider Freudian slip of the tongues, as well as jokes. Subconsciously, the jokes and the slips of the tongue could be some of the inner demons that some of the clients may be working with, and it's up to the therapist to pick up on these cues and internalize with the client. Overall, the psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic approach are here to bring basically the unconscious into consciousness awareness so that the client himself can be aware of the current behaviors and situations, thus ultimately changing for the better. Thank you, fellow students. Hope this has been insightful for you.